All right, let's go ahead and get started for today. Good afternoon and welcome back. I hope that you all are doing okay. I know that a lot of us are joining through Zoom today. I know that there's been people that have been traveling or have had travel, competition stuff canceled, and I know it's definitely been a pretty chaotic year so far. If you haven't been able to come to class or join through Zoom and you feel like you're falling behind or just need some additional support as you're working through the quarter, just let me know, and I'm happy to help you either through email or setting up a meeting or just helping you to get caught up and stay at a good pace and following some of the things to do. Again, I know this is a challenging time to be a student and work through things, so I appreciate all of your hard work and focus so far this quarter. Remember that if you're feeling sick or you've been in contact with somebody who has tested positive, to get in touch with Student Affairs will help if you need to be put into quarantine. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started for today. This week, we are going to be shifting gears, moving away from a discussion about how we use listening in small groups to focusing on culture and the ways that we engage in intercultural communication and international communication in groups too. But before we do that, I want to do a bit of time in class as a way to check in on your upcoming writing assignments. So what I'd like you to do is to take some time on your own, and you can write or type this as part of your attendance credit for today. And first, to touch base about the status of your group membership reflection assignment. So as a reminder, for this assignment, I'm asking you to think about a group that you're either currently a part of, such as a team or extracurricular or community group, or group that you've been a part of in the past. And this assignment is asking you to think about your own membership and participation within that group. So first, take some time to talk about the status of the assignment. Do you already have a draft done and ready to go? And maybe you're just making revisions. Do you have part of a draft done? Have you not written it, but do you have a plan on how to write it? Secondarily, take a minute to share what you chose to write about for the group. So for instance, the group that you chose, why you chose that group, so on. And then lastly, if you have any remaining questions for me about this assignment, including what I'm looking for, how I'll be grading, the ways to do well in this assignment, you're welcome to jot those questions down and I'll answer them in just a little bit. give you a couple more minutes to work on this. Go ahead and finish the current sentence that you're writing, working on. I want to start by seeing if there's any questions that I can answer related to this assignment that might have come up as you were writing and thinking about this. And folks on Zoom, you're welcome to share if you have any questions as well. Yes.
So when we're citing something like within our paper, and we're saying, are we like reflecting off what the book said, like saying, oh, this is what I use from this section of the book to something with this group?
Right. So if you're defining like or using a concept that comes from the book, that's when you would typically want to cite, right? So for instance, Melvin self-perception inventory. Say you're saying, you know, I'm a plant, and you define what that is, then you cite the textbook, and then you could apply that to your own life, right? And when you apply it, right, you only need to include the cite when you're defining the term. When you're talking about it in your own life, then you've already done that work, right? So that's a good question. So when you are, again, defining or explaining the terms that you're using, that's when you want to include the citations, right? Because those will help to set up your reflection and your analysis. So good question. Again, if you have concerns about when you're citing or if you're citing the way that you should, I'm happy to look at rough drafts or outlines. If you find yourself hitting a crunch as you're citing, I'd much rather have a late paper than a paper that doesn't include or doesn't cite those sources. I did want to direct you again to Canvas, which has everything that you need in order to complete the assignment. And just to remind you of a couple things that are related to this one. Right, so when you go to course, it's listed under week 3, it should also be showing up for this week. Again, if you click this link, you can access the prompt. Hi, Devin. I don't believe that I'm muted now. There is audio that's showing up through here. So for this prompt, right, you can take a look at these 3 different parts. Again, one way that you could separate out this assignment, right, is to divide it up by paragraphs and to address each of these 3 different parts. The first thing I'm looking at, right, is how the small group communicates, including some of its norms or unwritten rules, right? The ways that group members relate to one another. So for instance, if you're talking about the ways that members of your group regularly interact or share ideas or thoughts, right? Then that could be a way that your group communicates. As I mentioned just a minute ago with the second part, right? Your own role in membership is a big part too. So we went over Bellman's self-perception inventory earlier, which went through those 9 different categories. You can think about one that really makes sense to you to describe and explain using examples as to how it connects. And then lastly, be thinking about the strengths and weaknesses, right? In looking through a couple rough drafts so far, I think one of the biggest differences between a B or a C paper, right, and an A paper would be a B and a C paper says, I'm a team worker, right? I work in a group actively, I participate. So if it's fairly vague, right, then it's not really getting at some of these details. But if you were to say, I'm a team worker through this example, where I help to install a new light fixture and help to manage technology among an older group of people, I was able to use these skills, XYZ, right? You provide more explanation, example, and detail that helps to support your key ideas. So I really recommend that including good details and observations from your group is really a good way to build out some of these ideas more. And again, the rubric is on the second page. I encourage you to use the rubric kind of as a checklist as you're working through, since that's what I use. Defining and explaining and using the course, way to connect. Remember, it should be at least 2 pages in length. One thing I noticed from a couple rough drafts to think about in structure, right, is that you don't need to include an introduction that goes over like small group communication or communication in general in a super broad way, right? So you don't need to say it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Small group communication is how members of a group work together, or like really broad things like that, right? Instead, you might say, I chose to examine this group, and then provide that introduction that overviews the group itself. So you don't need a fluffy introduction. You can just get into the nitty-gritty of the group and what you'll be talking about. Make sure to cite. Again, I have the full APA citation available for you to access on Canvas. I posted it as an announcement. One thing that I did notice from a couple rough drafts is that if you are including a direct quotation, right, you are going to need to include a page number. So make sure that you're including the page number to correspond to those citations. I encourage you to look back through pages of the book that cover some of that material, and then use that so that you can get those page numbers written. So again, I just wanted to overview that really quick for you. And then what I'd like to do next then is we've gone over some of the things about this. I would like you to find a partner or a group of 3, and I want you to just take a minute to share and talk a little bit about your current progress on this group membership reflection. So how's it been going? What have you been working on so far? And what small group did you choose for this assignment? Why? This is just a chance to share and to compare your ideas. Zoom folks, I'm going to put you into some breakout rooms so that you can talk in a small group about this as well.
Yeah. So where am I? I've been through that for you. So I've like an outline, but I'm deciding to just kind of get it done. I'm like practice on and then I know what group I want to do. I have like ideas in my head for it, but
I haven't written it out yet, but I have no plan with it. Because yeah, so just role play, sorry, maybe stuff like that. So said some work that we're making it right, adding rules to it, and be a large group of rounds. But I'll be describing where it's doing so far, who are make sure that they're doing their job. and stuff. But that's basically what it is. I have a whole bunch of knowledge on this. We're not a reader. And it's just kind of starting. Yeah, we do this for, we do this for a game from Roblox. Oh, so that's what we do it on. They already have
So give you a couple more minutes on this. Oh, he was just there.
Oh, secret, right? Oh. How that.
So I just wanted to give you all a second to share and think about your projects and what you're thinking about for your group reflection. Again, this is not a big, scary, high stakes assignment, but it's a way for us to start to apply and think about some of the stuff we've been talking about so far in the quarter. Just as a couple of reminders before we move on. Again, this is due on Wednesday by midnight. The late assignment policy is if it's unexcused, right, then it is -5% for each day something's late. But, right, if you do have an emergency or something has come up that's affected your ability to finish, the extenuating circumstance does not have that penalty. Also remember that at the beginning of the quarter, you were given a get out of jail free card. That means you can turn in one assignment by the end of the quarter with no grade penalty up to a week late. So you can choose to use that for this assignment if you want to. It is use it or lose it, so you don't get any extra credit if you don't use it the whole quarter. It's more designed to help if you have an emergency that comes up and you're not able to do that. And then I can still look at outlines or drafts. Again, I've received a few of them already, but please turn them in by the end of the day today if you are planning to do those. That way I can turn that around for you. I also am available for office hours, including right after class from 2 to 3, and also sometimes in the morning and early afternoon if you want to talk to me a little bit more, either face-to-face or through Zoom. So those are some things related to that. Any last questions about this one? Great. So last week, we were talking again about listening and why it's important to listen in small groups. We did an activity last week where I was asking you to think about if you were with a group of people preparing for a job interview, how would you use pre-listening to create a good environment? Bill brought up some good points about how you made a good physical space where people feel like they're being heard and listened to. Also creating norms and rules if a meeting was happening virtually, right? And a lot of these things connect pretty closely to culture. If we think about culture and sort of our collection of experiences as something that we can amplify in small groups by listening and supporting members of groups, then those things really deeply relate to each other, right? We inevitably, when we're part of groups, have to interact with people from a lot of different cultures and perspectives. And we will find that groups over time can form their own cultures and identities. We also talked about good and bad practices of listening. Again, the ways that we can use and apply listening skills. Again, pre-listening covers a lot of different elements, right? Including physical location, the norms of the group, and some of the barriers that can impact us in becoming good listeners as well. We also talked about the idea that listening is a dance, right? It's a give or take. One of the core ideas was reciprocity. If you're listening to somebody, but it doesn't seem like they're paying attention or listening a whole lot back, you might be frustrated or withdraw. or call them out, right? So listening is really about showing your care for somebody else, and also about moving away from your own perspective to thinking about listening in the ways that it impacts and relates to others. So for this class, again, we're going to focus a little bit more on culture and some of the ways that we can understand culture through communication. So I just kind of in a super broad way, off the top of your head, would like to hear from a couple people. You're welcome to join if you're on Zoom as well, either verbally or through the chat, as to what culture is in your own words. How would you define culture?
It's about if you're ever writing about.
It's in general, right? It doesn't need to be a perfect or full definition. Yes.
I define culture as being from like different backgrounds or having like a different perspective on how things work.
Yeah. So background and perspective on life definitely play a role. What else goes into defining culture? Yeah, kind of.
Beliefs and values.
Yeah.
And norms and stuff like that.
Beliefs, values, norms, right? Those definitely get at culture as well. So these are good starting points and ways to start thinking about and defining what culture is, right? So culture is basically a large collection of different elements, right? And again, one of the key ideas from this week is that culture matters for small group communication in two ways. People from diverse cultures, backgrounds, and identities, right, are going to be a part of your group. And small group communication is about understanding and supporting diverse cultures and identities as they engage in groups. If somebody comes in, right, and English is not their first language, it means creating an environment that's inclusive, that lets that person participate and to understand, right? If you're working on a group project and the group project involves writing cursive, right, you're not going to assume that everybody knows or is familiar with writing cursive. So culture covers a lot of different elements. And pictured here is a map. It's really cool as a world map of the indigenous tribes and groups, including in the state of Oregon, right? And maps out where many of these cultures are located. And things about geographic space play a really big role in identifying those cultures and the ways that those cultures develop, right? The use of mountains, oceans, rivers, and other physical aspects of terrain have defined many of the elements of cultures for a variety of different tribes and groups and populations. That's an example, right, of thinking about culture in terms of indigenous perspectives. So culture involves, right, the beliefs, right? Beliefs are what people see as important to them, what matters, right? For instance, you might believe in some type of afterlife or heaven or something after death, right? That would be a belief that maybe you feel in a cultural or religious lens. An attitude is what you carry into something, how you feel about something. For instance, in a lot of Western cultures, right, conflict is seen as something to win, whereas in a lot of non-Western cultures, conflict is seen as a sort of negotiation or part of the process that is not about winners or losers, but it's about smoothing things out. Values, right? Values can be either terminal or a means to an end. So for instance, an instrumental value is something like money, right? Money, green paper, right, on its own does not have value, but it's a means to an end, such as security, food and water, those types of things. Whereas things like food, water, shelter, family, those types of things are terminal values or ends to themselves, right? So the things that members of a culture see as important, for instance, environment, nature, and so on, could impact culture as well. And traditions, right? So cultures are developed over time. For instance, if you're a member of an athletic team, and maybe your team has a tradition where the MVP of every game gets to have ice cream and gets to have everybody go out for ice cream with them, right? That would be a tradition developed over time as part of that group and part of that group membership. I wanted to show you as well, this entire map is a really interesting way to look at indigenous groups and cultures and the ways that those develop over time, right? So the map kind of is this whole big map of the world, and then you can zoom in on different parts of it to examine where some of the geographic lines are. And I think it's interesting because it doesn't portray like the standard, what we would think of a lot of times as the standard physical borders between the states, right? But rethinks how geographic space could be defined in terms of other groups. So some of the most predominant tribes in Eastern Oregon and Washington, right, are the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla peoples that are located over here. And again, you can see the way that the use of physical space, including mountain ranges, rivers, and so on, have helped to delineate and define the ways that many of these cultures have developed over time. So again, I think it's a useful way of thinking about culture and some of the ways that culture can be developed. Dr. Linda Jarofsky over in anthropology and sociology actually does some really cool active research with indigenous populations and tribes throughout Eastern Oregon, and is a great person to reach out to if this is a topic that you find interesting and want to explore further. So one of the key ideas here, right, is that given that culture covers a lot of different aspects of identity, of subjectivity, right, then it's important for us as members of a group to understand and engage with culture in a thoughtful and inclusive way. One example of this is ASL, or American Sign Language. I'm curious, is there anybody here who has taken like an ASL class or is familiar with ASL? Yeah, JP. Cool. So ASL, right, is interesting because it's one form of sign language, but even within ASL, there's different accents or ways of using sign language, right? So using the example of ASL, right, intracultural communication would be various ASL speakers communicating with one another, right? Using the language, conveying signs to one another as a group. That's intracultural because it's members of the same culture that are communicating. So if you've taken interpersonal communication, you probably talked about intrapersonal communication, right? Intrapersonal communication is communication with yourself, pumping yourself up in the mirror. In the same way, intracultural communication is communication within the same culture. So if you're part of a team, you're working together, and you're looking at within that group how that culture is developed, right? That would be intercultural. Intercultural communication, which is a class we offer here at EOU, really interesting way to look at those ideas in more detail. If you haven't already taken that class, is more about understanding communication across different cultures, people that come from different cultural perspectives and backgrounds. Thinking back to ASL, right? An example of intercultural communication could be a parent of a deaf child, right? The parent might be hearing, but the parent chooses to learn and familiarize themselves with ASL so that they can communicate to their child interculturally. That's an example that we see sometimes, right? Where somebody learns a language or learns norms or ways of communicating to somebody from a different culture to include and to help that person participate. So that would be one example of using intercultural communication effectively, right? And this is important because one of the major challenges to working in groups effectively, right, is the challenge of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism being the belief that we try to work away from, right? That somebody's own culture is better than everybody else's. There's a lot of reasons that oftentimes humans gravitate toward ethnocentrism. A big one, right, is that we like what we're familiar with. We grow up in a culture, we watch shows and film, we listen to music, right? We probably feel more positively about what we're exposed to. Another reason, right, is I don't know if you're a difference of hearing or seeing something and seeing it as less than because it's outside of what we're familiar with. So if somebody speaks with a different accent or style, right, or engages in a way that we're not used to, it's important for us not to devalue contributions and perspectives that folks from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds bring to the table. So intercultural communication in groups is about challenging the biases that we might leave at the door. So Stuart Hall is a really important person to know when we're talking about and exploring issues of culture, right, and cultural studies. Stuart Hall was a Jamaican-born cultural theorist, right, and Hall's key contribution and idea was the development of something known as cultural studies. So if you've taken a class in humanities, again, anthroposophy, philosophy, history, even art and theater classes, there's a good chance that Hall's work on culture and cultural studies has implicated it either directly or indirectly, right? And he was exploring this in the context of the 1970s and 1980s in Britain. He was trying to understand, with a lot of the social political change, of populations changing, right, of greater diversity and underrepresented perspectives, right, what that change meant for how we thought about culture. And moving away from the idea that culture is not just a country or nationality, right, it refers to a lot of other sets of shared experiences that exist outside of that. So what I want to do is to show a brief clip that involves Hall speaking about and addressing some of the ways that identity and culture interact. And I think as you're watching, it's important to take note of the ways that culture is defined and some of the ways that, while this is discussed in the context of changes in 1970s and 80s Britain, that it still impacts and really substantially implicates the ways that we think about culture today.
The 70s and 80s witnessed brutal race riots, born of the political tensions of the time. And for one thinker, this was yet another symptom of a real struggle over culture. Stuart Hall was born in Jamaica, and after winning a scholarship to Oxford, went on to make his name as Britain's leading cultural theorist.
In the 1980s, more and more schools will be taking in children from diverse family and cultural backgrounds.
In 1989, Hall saw hope for Britain's future in the acceptance and celebration of its multiculturalism, as he explained on The Late Show.
As we slide out of the 1980s into a new decade, the key question is whether we're moving into new times. Who's going to define the cultural themes of the next 10 years? No one thinks harder about this question than Stuart Hall.
You see the impulse of the British to close in on older images of themselves in order to, tight little island, drawing their suits around themselves, defend themselves against all this otherness that is pressing on them. And then I look at young Black and Asian kids in the third generation who've been born here and brought up here, so they're not from anywhere else. And I just think creatively, culturally, they're just on top of the world. I mean, they don't know where the next meal is coming from, but culturally, they just are enormously in a rich creative mode.
When Stuart arrives in England, these questions of colour and differentiation and difference begin to obsess him. He begins to think, how do I describe myself? What sort of person am I? But of course, the idea of culture in Stuart Hall is very, very important because of what he wants to say about multiculturalism and immigrants to Britain. The Britishness that might be forced on them in many cases, as Hall points out, is really a very old-fashioned Britishness. It's the Britishness of empire. It's the Britishness which has nothing to do with these people.
At the start of the century, thinkers had fought for a single idea of culture. But by the end, it was as diverse as British society itself. And Stuart Hall made it clear that culture is a constantly changing force.
We don't actually know what we value in culture anymore. Everything's interesting. High culture, low culture, from advertising to pop art to great art. It's all in a kind of mishmash now.
But I think that there's a deeper question lying behind your question to me. I think you're asking me, how can people live without, some sense that there's an ultimate truth or ultimate scale of values? And I don't know, but I don't any longer think that this is just a transitional phase and that we're moving on to some other more settled period. I think, culturally, we're in the kind of phase of permanent revolution.
Okay. So I wanted to share that because, again, even though it comes from a different context, right, the sort of origins of cultural studies, Hall, exploring it in 1970s in Eastern Britain, right, is doing so at a time of major cultural change. There's more and more, not only folks that come from migrant or immigrant backgrounds, but also, again, the population of diverse, BIPOC and underrepresented perspectives who are born, right, and identify their nationality as their current country of origin, and now are in a place of trying to define and think about identity over time. So Hall's work with cultural studies and then understanding that within, right, a country or population, there is such an array of experiences and perspectives to think about and to engage with. I think it's a useful way to be thinking about how members of small groups engage with culture too. So here on the right is Clifford Geertz, who is a social anthropologist, ethnographer, who's famous for a study in which he went to Bali and he did a bunch of ethnographic and field work examining Balinese cockfighting and just did this like deep dive into the world of Balinese cockfighting and discovered, right, that was a core part of Balinese culture and identity. It was this performance, it was this practice, and then there was this way of understanding how cultures form identity, senses of shared values, and beliefs that were important, right? So folks, again, such as Hall and Geertz, offer really important insights into the ways that we think about culture. One of them being, right, is that the idea that cultures can be compared, and not in a, this culture is better than this culture, right? But in a, there are ways to measure cultures that are felt differently. One example we've talked about in class is context, right? High context cultures, where there's a lot more subtlety and nuance and nonverbal communication, and lower context cultures where communication is more direct and straightforward. That's one way to compare cultures. There's other comparisons that we'll be talking about, things such as power distance, time orientation, and so on. Another key idea here, right, is that understanding a local perspective, right, really engaging with that culture and group is a way to better understand it. Again, for folks like Geertz who spent months in Bali understanding and trying to engage with Balinese culture, right, that was a way of using local perspectives for insights. Another idea, though, is that in order to engage, better understand culture, you don't need to know every single thing about culture, right? For instance, if you learned that within a culture, it's customary for the elders to eat first, right? You don't need to know everything, but you do know that that's a norm or a practice that you could do to be more culturally sensitive and thoughtful, right? That is, that cultures have learnable rules or behavior that members of a culture practice that an outsider can learn and utilize for themselves. For instance, right, depending on where you've traveled, if you've gone abroad, you know that in a lot of countries, it's considered rude or disrespectful to tip, right? That could be an example of learning rules that you could apply and use depending on the culture. Another idea here is that experience matters, right? Being able to understand, particularly from a personal perspective, what the culture is really important. One example of this has been folks that might come from neurodiverse perspectives, right? Folks who might have disabilities or differences, including ADD, ADHD, autism, and so on, right? One challenge that emerges in a lot of these kinds of circles and discussions is that for folks who are neurodivergent, there's a unique set of experiences and challenges that they might choose to share. But perspective matters because there might be folks that are like allies or parents who attempt to be supportive, but aren't always because they don't have that personal perspective to bring to the table, right? So part of being an ally or being supportive of people from different cultures is to acknowledge, hey, I don't know what it means firsthand to experience this, but I can listen and try to learn. Another idea, right, is that things such as international businesses, organizations are also impacted, right? So the idea of neoliberalism has emerged in recent years to suggest a combination between globalization, right, us being more connected globally, and also that there's sort of this emphasis on global capitalism. So we have a lot of free trade agreements and trade and relationships between members of different cultures that brings many different cultures together, but also can reinforce some disparities and challenges, right? For instance, preserving cultural identity in the massive market of international trade. And again, as I mentioned before, there's a good chance that cultural studies has impacted at least one other class you've taken, right? Culture connects to multiple disciplines, again, including communication, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, history, economics, business, and so on. So being a member of a culture, right, brings with it some challenges. So one example, right, is the use of gender stereotypes that, you have what appears to be, right, masculine figure and things like video game controller, a dollar sign, and so on are gendered markers, right? And so those are some of the stereotypes or challenges that we find ourselves running into oftentimes in culture that we're going to push back against, right? One of these is prejudice, right? Prejudging, assuming how people will behave as members of a culture, right? Oftentimes in a way that is negative and guides how we approach that group, right? So assuming, for instance, that because somebody has English as their second language, that they're less knowledgeable is an example of prejudice. Over-focusing on culture and ignoring the individual is an important tightrope to walk, right? If you think about a group that you're a part of, maybe you're a part of a sports team, right? And that's a big part of who you are and what you do, but that is not all you are, right? You have hobbies, activities, ideas, interests, backgrounds, and other aspects of your identity. So one challenge is to avoid flattening people into just being a representative for their culture. Another challenge, right, are stereotypes. We oftentimes use stereotypes when we lack information or we fill in the gaps, right, by suggesting just general things about a person, including their activities or interests and so on the basis of things like race or like such as gender stereotypes, right? And another challenge, right, is that we also don't want to homogenize a group. If a group comes from culturally diverse perspectives, right, it's important for us to acknowledge and to engage with that difference. Again, if you assume that everybody in your group knows how to write cursive and somebody grew up, in a culture and an educational background where that is just not a thing that was taught or seen as important, then that difference matters for how the group members work together, right? It's easy for people to feel left behind or people to feel unincluded if what's assumed to be a similar or shared experience is not felt. So as we've kind of hit on a little bit already, right, culture can really impact small groups in a lot of different ways, such as the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Cayuse Indigenous peoples that we were mentioning earlier, right? Small groups can have a set of shared goals and purposes. For instance, right, small groups can have a goal of finishing a project or working together in a way that might align with the shared beliefs or values of members of another culture. Small groups also have history or context, right? There's a good chance it's part of an extracurricular athletic team that there's like a hall of fame or some trophies or history behind your group. And there's norms, rules, and customs, what you say and don't say, do and do not do, right? So in that way, that culture is similarly developed in a small group. So what I want you to do in the remaining time that we have for today is to return to the attendance activity we were looking at earlier. And thinking about the group that you've chosen for your reflection, to think about the ways that your group has culture. For instance, its unwritten norms, values, and goals, and some of the ways that those are communicated. So I'll give you a bit of time to think about this and just jot down some ideas about how your small group might connect to this idea of culture. So I'll let you go ahead and finish if you're currently writing. It's okay if it's not fully developed. It's just a chance to brainstorm and start to think about these ideas. I know we covered a lot of ground for today, but we're kind of starting broad and defining culture and the ways that culture can be defined in groups. And we'll be getting into some of the nitty gritty a little bit more on some of these ideas as we move forward. So to wrap up for today, please make sure to give yourself some time to work on that reflection. If you haven't already finished it, again, I'll do my best to help if you have last minute questions or things that come up that I can do to help. We talked a little bit about culture, right? Including how to define and think about what culture is. And some of the ways that culture relates to small groups, including the ways that they behave, and how membership of groups over time can itself form its own kind of culture. So going into Wednesday's class, we're going to further discuss culture and the ways that we manage things, including uncertainty, as we work with cultures and groups. So go ahead and email or pass forward your attendance today if you haven't already done so. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday.